A man named Brock, a strong, determined middle-aged broker, is returning home after a tough workday. It's late at night, and he's heading out of the city where he works, towards a remote village where his family and peace await. The old wooden houses, quiet streets, small lit windows, everything feels familiar. He hears the tires of his car hitting the asphalt as he speeds down the deserted road. The wind moves the tree branches, and with the fog comes a strange feeling, everything is too quiet. Not like usual. He flicks the radio switch, but all he hears is static, no sound. The windows of his car fog up from the cold, and he closes them, trying to push away the creeping sense of unease spreading through his body. The darkness around him grows denser. The fog engulfs the edge of the road, and even the headlights seem unable to dispel this unusual twilight silence. Everything's fine, just fatigue, Brock thinks, although his intuition whispers something different. He glances quickly in the rearview mirror but sees nothing but empty darkness behind him. The feeling that someone is watching him won't leave. And then, a sudden sound. Footsteps. At first, faint, almost imperceptible. They disappear when Brock looks again in the mirror, but his heart begins to race. Brock jerks the steering wheel. The road begins to get rougher, and suddenly, as if the car is afraid of something, it stutters and unexpectedly stops with a dull thud. He tries to turn the key, but the engine only rumbles and dies. A strong feeling of uncertainty grips him. He slows down and stops, carefully watching the growing silence around him. He looks in the mirror again. And again, empty darkness. Only the line of the road stretching into nowhere and the dark trees standing like silent witnesses beside him. Damn it! Why now? Brock mutters, glancing at his phone. No signal. And it's been like this for 5 minutes. He's losing connection with the world, almost with reality. Could this be what he felt earlier? Is he really in danger? Suddenly, in the darkness, he notices a strange movement, as if someone is moving in the forest surrounding the road. A slight figure seems to disappear between the trees. Brock tries to draw attention, but his scream is swallowed by the night's silence. He pulls out a flashlight, but it only flashes for a few seconds, quickly turning off, preventing him from seeing the dark silhouette. Fear begins to cloud his thoughts. Another strange sensation, as if someone is approaching. At first, no sounds, just the disappearance of the forest's usual hum, until he hears it, someone breathing slowly, heavily, right behind him. He turns around but sees nothing. Who's there? Brock's voice trembles. His hand grips the door handle tightly, preparing to run. The breathing is getting closer. He quickly turns around. Meanwhile, something begins to appear in the darkness. At first, it's just two small figures standing in the shadows of the trees. Their shapes are blurry, but it looks like they're staring directly at him. Brock moves closer, trying to make out their faces, but suddenly one of them darts to the side and disappears behind the branches. Brock shudders. He turns again, and one of those figures, standing right in front of him, suddenly moves, its face appearing in the headlights. He steps back a few paces but can't look away. She stands there, staring at him with empty eyes. No movement, just her silent gaze. And then, suddenly, he hears a loud sound, like something heavy falling. Brock's scream gets lost in the endless darkness, and the fog around him becomes even thicker. The feeling of being watched becomes unbearable. He no longer knows if this is real or if his mind has lost its grip on reality. Brock gritted his teeth and began heading back to his car, searching for his keys in his pocket. His heart was racing, and his hands were cold with fear. He opened the door and sat back in the cabin, trying to maintain control over his thoughts. However, the tension didn't subside, on the contrary, it grew. It was as if every sound, every shadow was amplified by the terrifying silence that filled the forest. He tried starting the engine again, useless. He checked his phone a second time, but there was still no signal. This was starting to feel ominous. Now it was real. He was surrounded not only by trees but also by unknown figures watching him from the darkness. Nothing moved, only his heart, beating faster and faster. This wasn't a coincidence. He felt that something was happening to him. Something was wrong. Suddenly, one of the figures reappears, slowly approaching the car. Brock, pale, looks out the window. It was the figure of a man, with clothes clearly covered in dirt and torn edges. He wasn't moving, just standing still next to the car, staring into the darkness, as if not noticing Brock. However, his gaze seemed strange. There was no emotion in his eyes, only emptiness, a void that felt as if the night itself had been trapped in those deep eyes. "Hey!" Brock's voice erupted from his chest. "Can't you hear me?" he shouted through the window. The man didn't respond, but now his movements became more sinister. He slowly turned around and began walking, never taking his eyes off the car. Brock tried to open the door and get out, but something held him back. It wasn't just an obstacle. It was as if some force didn't want him to leave the car. He felt that every movement was like a fierce struggle for his own life. The inside of the car grew colder, even though he turned on the heater. Everything around him started to feel unnaturally silent, as if in an inverted world. The back door of the car suddenly creaked, and Brock felt something invisible enter his car. A distant, vague breathing filled the cabin. Brock jerked and looked in the rearview mirror. Behind him stood another figure. The same one that had appeared earlier, the man with empty eyes. They were standing next to him, separated by just a few inches. Their gazes pierced him, tearing him apart. And then, just when Brock felt that losing this moment would mean his death, the silence suddenly broke with a scream. Something heavy slammed from behind. The car door, as if pushed by an invisible hand, abruptly opened, and Brock saw the figure. This figure was no longer just a silent observer. Now it was much closer, and its face was becoming clearer, though its features were distorted and deformed to a terrifying degree. I can't. This can't be real." Brock's voice trembled with panic as he began to realize that this wasn't just a hallucination. The figure didn't respond, but he saw its hands, with terrifying black nails, reaching out toward him. These weren't just hands. These were hands that hadn't known the light for a long time. And then, as the darkness consumed the entire car, Brock heard something wrestling behind him, and in a moment, everything went utterly silent. His body became incredibly heavy, as if each movement required an unimaginable force. He slowly turned his head back and saw one figure standing right in front of him. Now it was incredibly close. Its skin was oddly gray, and its face twisted in pain that could not be understood. Brock tried to get up, but it was impossible. His body wouldn't obey. He opened his eyes, but the darkness still prevented him from seeing even his own hands. The car door slammed shut again. And the darkness, along with the echo of a destroyed soul, remained. The silence that enveloped Brock was oppressive. It felt endless, as if the night itself had decided to swallow everything alive around him. All his attempts to move were in vain, and he felt his heart beating weaker and weaker, as if the final seconds of his life were passing. The wind, seeping through the windows, felt like cold fingers touching his skin. He tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy, filled not only with cold but with invisible forces. Suddenly, after a long pause, Brock felt something. Instantly, all his senses reacted to the presence of the same silhouette he had seen in the rearview mirror. At first, he heard a familiar, but slightly altered breath, now much closer. It was heavy, muffled, and relentless. The door opened again, but this time, not with a crack, but with a dull sound, as if something big and heavy was pulling it toward itself. And it wasn't a natural sound. Instinctively, Brock understood that he had fallen into a trap. A trap that someone had set for him. "No. I can't." Brock tried to scream, but his voice sounded thin and powerless. Something heavy touched his back, and his face twisted in pain. Then he felt a sharp movement in his chest, as if a hand had penetrated inside his body. When he forced himself to turn around, the last figure stood in the doorway of the car. Now its eyes glowed with some supernatural light coming from within. And in its gaze was such emptiness that even the darkness itself could be compared to it. This wasn't just a person, this was a part of this night, a part of these forests. A feeling of helplessness overwhelmed Brock, and he realized that the only thing left was to accept this cold nightmare. Suddenly, everything disappeared. The breathing, the hands, the pain. And all that remained was darkness. The next morning, as locals passed by, they saw Brock's abandoned car, standing still. All the doors were closed. Of course, they didn't know what had happened to the driver. They only noticed how the fog slowly wrapped around the car, as if the night itself wanted to leave it there forever. A few days later, strange rumors began circulating in the village. They say that Brock became a part of this forest darkness, and his face appears in the windows of houses during night trips. Sometimes, when someone drives down this road, it feels like he's chasing them through the darkness. But when they look back, there's no one there. And anyone who dares to drive down this road at night eventually feels his presence, like an unseen observer. The only question is, will they be the next ones? The darkness of the city, like a living creature, was consuming every corner. The streets were empty, with only a few shaded signs barely illuminating the road. James, a young man in a serious suit, was driving through the night city in his car. He was tired after a long workday, and the thought of quickly returning home distracted him from the world around him. All this time, he hadn't noticed how the darkness was growing more oppressive, and the streetlight illumination seemed to be weakening. One of the streetlights suddenly went out. James glanced at his watch. It was already midnight. He tried to pick up speed, but the faster he drove, the more it seemed the city was becoming less familiar. Only in the rearview mirror did he see some movement that made his heart beat faster. He stared intently, but saw nothing. All this time, he hadn't noticed how the road had changed. Now it looked different, endless, dark, and infinite. It was as if he had entered an endless loop, and his car had become just a mechanism sliding down the empty streets. As soon as he looked in the mirror again, James felt something was wrong. At first, it was just an indistinct sound behind him, quiet, like someone was lightly tapping on the glass. He turned around, but the car was empty. Only emptiness, from which strange shadows began to appear, swaying from the movement of the headlights. James pressed the gas pedal, trying to leave behind this strange, terrifying feeling. But the faster he drove, the more he felt that someone was following him. His hands were sweaty, and he kept checking the mirrors, but he could never see anything except foggy shadows. "This can't be," he thought, hearing the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt. Suddenly, he heard a distinct, terrifying knock in the trunk. James's gaze involuntarily shifted to the window. And then something happened. The darkness around him began to move, as if it was wrapping itself around the car. With incredible speed, red lights flashed in front of him, and then it was dark again. James stopped on the side of the road, his heart pounding. He tried to compose himself and turned on the radio, but it only emitted static. He got out of the car to look at the night. Nothing was visible except the empty streets. Suddenly, he heard a strange step behind him. James turned around and saw a shadow. Tall and indistinct, it was moving toward him, becoming clearer, more realistic with each step. This wasn't just a reflection. This was something alive. All his instincts screamed, "Run!" But he couldn't move. The shadow was getting closer. James felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The shadow drew closer, its outline becoming sharper. It was like a living, pulsating force that blended darkness and fear. James stood still, unable to move, though his heart pounded wildly, like a bird in a cage. Suddenly, the shadow stopped. It became completely black and just hung in the air, like part of a dark substance absorbing everything around it. James tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. The shadow threw behind it a terrifying figure, an unnatural humanoid creature with an empty space where its face should be. Its hands were spread wide, and it slowly extended them toward him, as if he were to be its next victim. Realizing there was no way out, James suddenly turned and ran back to his car. He threw himself inside with his last strength and tried to start the engine. But the car wouldn't start. Several more attempts, and nothing. Panic overwhelmed him, and then he saw it. The creature was already at his door. It gently touched the window, leaving behind an ominous darkness that slowly enveloped the car. At that moment, James noticed something on the back seat, a dark hand reaching toward him, and it wasn't part of this creature. It was another shadow, not human, but familiar. It seemed to emerge from the very darkness that began to close in on him, filling the entire space. The flow of fear left him no room for hope. The creature outside didn't move, but its presence was so strong that it was hard to breathe. James felt his heart pounding in his chest, heavy like a hammer. The shadow moved toward him, as if it were part of the city itself, part of the night's silence. And in that moment, when he was almost ready to give up, the shadow sensed that James had gripped the steering wheel tightly. He hadn't believed in this until now, but now he understood. The creature wasn't here just to harm him. It was here to take him. And suddenly, as the darkness consumed everything, James slammed on the gas. The car roared, and he sped down the empty road, tearing through the darkness behind him. But the same movements followed him, the dark figure blending with the night's silence. James couldn't tell if it was just an illusion or something even more terrifying, but he felt as though everything happening was calling greater danger toward him. The car briefly stalled while he tried to turn the key in the ignition. But at last, the horn sounded, and the engine came to life. However, as soon as he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the worst thing. There was no road, only endless darkness. The creature was getting closer. It stopped again, and James realized he was trapped. He wouldn't be going anywhere. James desperately tried to start the car, but couldn't. The engine groaned faintly and fell silent the moment he released the key. He tried again, but realized it was futile. The car was stopped, and that no longer mattered. Death hung in the air, and it was drawing near. The darkness surrounded the car like a thick, sticky substance. James felt his heart race, sweat rolling down his forehead. He desperately fumbled around the seat, searching for something that could help, but found nothing. And then he noticed it. In the right rearview mirror, not just the dark figure. Something else, something even more terrifying and familiar. It was his own shadow. The shadow that stood behind him, watching his every move, as if it had never left him. And this wasn't just a shadow, it was his own fear, his own nightmarish alter ego, which he could no longer hide. Suddenly, he heard a voice. It wasn't quite a voice, but a muffled, indistinct whisper coming from the heart of the shadow itself. "You can't escape," the voice said. "All your mistakes follow you. And we've come to take you." James tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled out the key and struck the glass with it, but even the sound of the blows seemed blurred, indistinct, as though everything around him was melting into a nightmare. The shadow began to lower over the car, like a merciless hand, tightening around him from within. And then the unexplainable happened. The rearview mirror began to crack, its surface covered with fissures spreading across the entire thickness of the glass. And in those moments, when everything around him seemed unreal, James felt his body being pulled by something invisible, something that kept him from moving. He screamed, but his voice was drowned in silence. The shadow consumed him completely, and in the final moment before everything plunged into darkness, he understood, he had become part of what he had feared. He had become part of the city, part of this horrific night where there was no place for salvation. The next morning, when the light touched the city once again, the road was covered only by a foggy veil. Local drivers passed by, and no one noticed anything unusual. James' car remained in place, but the doors were open. There were no signs of struggle or blood inside, only emptiness and moisture left on the seat. But in the rearview mirror, on the cracked surface, the reflection of a dark shadow could still be seen. Once again, that incomprehensible, foreign presence stood there, absorbing everything around it.